Welcome to Adventures in Life. I'm your host, Earl Beecher. Our guest is someone you may recognize by his voice before you recognize his face. He has one of the most famous voices, I would say, in possibly the nation now, at least in the Los Angeles basin. He's Ken Borgers. He is the morning drive host on America's Jazz Station.
Correct.
And what jazz station is that, Ken?
88.1 KLON, Earl.
I bet everybody's heard you say that a few times.
Yes, indeed.
Tell me, what is KLON?
KLON is a station licensed to California State University, Long Beach. We have been there playing jazz for 15 years. We're celebrating right now our 15th anniversary. And we call ourselves America's Jazz Station because not only do we reach Southern California, but we're heard by cable and satellite all over Western North America. We've got listeners in Canada, Mexico, the Virgin Islands, all over.
So it really is reaching out.
It is.
Is it possibly the biggest jazz station in the nation as a result of this?
I think, without boasting, it is the biggest jazz station in America. Now, our sister public radio station in Newark that serves New York City, WBGO, at 88.3 there, might take some exception to that statement. But with our satellite coverage and our cable coverage, I think we're the largest station in America.
I think that's very exciting. I'm going to share a couple of secrets with our viewers today. Ken is the reason I'm here. I don't think he knows that, but I went over to KLON in 1978 to promote some Paul Smith records one day.
I remember that.
And Ken said, "Oh, you're a business professor." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "We've been looking to do a business show." I said, "That's nice." And he said, No, I didn't make that clear. We want you to do a business show." And my reaction was, "Moi?" you know? And he didn't know what he turned loose on that. I wound up doing a series of shows for 2 or 3 years called Dr. Beecher's Business Forum, and they were business-type interviews. And this is where I first got my interviewing fun out of life, shall we say. And then from there I decided to get into video and started taking some script writing classes and got into the video afterwards. But Ken got it started.
I'm the one to blame.
You're the one to blame. Be careful. Anyway, when it came to the shows, we were doing business shows. And KLON was not a music station exclusively, although you were doing live music then.
We were. The time you're talking about, the late 70s, predates KLON's existence as a jazz station.
That's right.
At that point, the station was licensed to the Long Beach Unified School District. And we had 70 different kinds of programs on the air every week. We had opera and polka and bluegrass, and we had an all-Portuguese program in Portuguese done by people from the Portuguese community. And we had a very fine business show.
Thank you.
At the time. And we had a little bit of jazz, but it was not by any means our main focus.
Then the station moved to the university. I remember talking to President Horn and telling him he should look into this. He surprised me, he did. And the next thing I knew, you came over when?
Well, the station actually moved to Cal State Long Beach in 1981. In April of 1981, we made the move. It had been in negotiation for a period of time before that. In fact, about the time Prop 13 happened,
yes,
in the late 70s, I think it was 77,
yeah,
the school district decided that they couldn't really afford to have a public radio station. And around the country this was happening. Stations that were what was called local authority stations, that were owned by school districts, that were owned by city halls, city governments. Some city governments had licenses for public radio stations. They were all getting out of the business, turning the licenses over either to community groups or to universities. And that is what happened in Long Beach. The university's mission is to reach out to the community, much more so than a school district, which serves the kindergarten through 12th grade.
Okay, and no more Dr. Beecher's Business Forum. It became strictly jazz. Now, how did that happen? That wasn't very cool.
I've been meaning to talk to you about that.
Yeah, right.
what happened, as you know, is that the main reason for the station's move to Cal State was economic. The school district could no longer support the operation. The university took it over and brought in a general manager to run the operation from National Public Radio, a fellow who'd had a lot of national exposure. He was the former producer of All Things Considered, the prestigious nationwide news program nightly on National Public Radio. His name was Dave Cray. Dave came in, and one of the first things he did was sit down with me as the program director at the time and said, the first order of any business is to stay in business. And
I'll buy that.
As a business professor, you know what he's talking about.
Right.
And he said, what we need to do is we need to figure out something that we can do that will establish us as an identity. The programming you have is wonderful, but you have a lot of very small, devoted publics. And indeed, that was the mission of the school district when it wasn't doing instructional radio for the kindergarten through 12th grade. The rest of the time, the public radio, the community radio side, was focused on presenting programming for what they saw as disenfranchised publics.
Well, they were reaching out to the community, absolutely, and
serving,
to each segment of the community.
Serving segments that really had no place else to listen to the radio. And so we had a lot of little devoted tune-in audiences, but it wasn't enough to support an operation. The station didn't have an overall identity that was strong enough to keep it in survival.
How did you settle on jazz?
Dave and I sat down and we looked at the situation in Los Angeles radio at the time. The university, their first choice, I think, was for a classical music and news service.
Something similar to what they have at some of the other schools.
Right, notably KUSC at the University of Southern California. But as Dave Cray told them, there was already one of those. In fact, there were already 3 very good full-time classical music services, and the other public stations in town were presenting some classical music a good bit of the time. There was no reason for anyone to tune into KLON to get that service. And
okay, it'd be just another one.
It'd be just another one, and it'd be like having 2 NBC stations in a market, you know. And also, they were well established and
yes, they
had
were.
a big audience. So we needed to come up with our own identity. So we chose to eliminate classical music from consideration, which was a radical move at the time for public radio. Public radio makes, it has its survival base is classical music around the country. 66% of the stations are full-time classical music stations.
I didn't realize that.
So when you make a decision to eliminate that, it's a radical step. And people at the time said, you know, what are you going to do? You're crazy. People around the system, you know. And after extensive study, we came up with jazz as the thing to do. And when we looked at the market and considered the options, there really aren't that many other music programming concepts that garner a large enough audience to be viable as a public radio service. Of course, well, let's look at what other American musics are there to begin with that have a large audience. The first thing you'd think of was rock and roll, obviously, or some
rock and roll,
some derivative
blues,
thereof,
gospel.
Yes. But out of those 3, at least at the time, now blues has come on very strong, as you know.
And so is country.
It's huge, and so is country. But country and rock and roll were readily available on so-called free stations, not really free, commercial stations, you know, stations where listeners didn't have to support it with donations to make it work.
No, they had advertisers.
They had advertisers.
Which you didn't have access to, did you?
Right. We are a non-commercial station. We're licensed in that part of the FM band that has to be non-commercial. The 88 to 92 part of the FM band, the FCC has set aside for non-commercial stations. We can have underwriting, very low-key announcements, short, that don't use hyperbole. We can't say makers of the best, you know.
Right, right. Well, it's in television you have the same thing in the public sector.
KCET, same thing.
they say this program made possible by such and such a foundation.
You can have the legal corporate name of even of a commercial operation, Mobil Oil, for example.
I see, yes.
You can have the legal name and then a few words to describe it. But the words have to be limited to time, date, place, and nature. Very low-key kinds of things. So it's not attractive, particularly to advertisers, and as such, public broadcasting makes most of its money from the public, directly, in the form of contributions.
Now, on that point, I want to pause for a public service announcement. Stay with us. We'll be right back with Ken Borgers. Our guest is Ken Borgers, the man whose voice I'm sure you know, especially if you've listened to 88.1 on your FM dial. And if you haven't, I recommend you do. Ken, you were just telling us a little bit about how the public broadcasting sector works.
Yeah, well, you know, we were talking a little bit about how we became why we decided on jazz.
Yes.
And after looking at the market and eliminating classical music, eliminating rock and roll and country.
Why did you eliminate those? They're very popular.
They are, but again, people can get those easily by just turning on a commercial radio station. There's a lot of that around, and people aren't used to having to pay for it. Of course, they do pay for it. They pay for it with their ears because they have to put up with commercials.
Well, true.
But we decided those really weren't viable public radio music formats. So with the elimination of those and the elimination of classical music, we then looked at jazz and came up with the format that we have. Now, of course, we don't play all jazz. We play a very specific, or a few very specific kinds of jazz.
There's many kinds of jazz. In fact, when I was back your age, I used to think of jazz like Paul Whiteman and the razzmatazz sort of sound, and swing was a unique form. Now, swing is considered part of jazz, but I always liked swing. This was the era that I grew up in.
Well, swing music was the popular music, the rock and roll of its time, you know?
Yeah.
Everyone listened to it. It was America's music. There are elements of jazz in it, without a doubt, but and since then, since the swing era, it's kind of been lumped in as a part of
jazz.
Yeah.
Well, we went from the big band to the combo.
We did in the mid to late 40s, up time World War II ended. There are still big bands around, and big bands are still very popular. Not like they were. You don't have the touring bands, but there are.
I guess it's a matter of economics. It's expensive to move 20 people around.
It is, and very few people have been able to maintain it, as you know. I mean, you've still got the Count Basie Orchestra touring, you've still got the Duke Ellington Orchestra touring, but otherwise the bands are localized, usually, to particular...
There are some excellent local bands here in the Los Angeles area.
There are. We have some of the best bands in the world here.
Yes.
I mean, you list them, Bob Florence Big Band, the Bill Holman Big Band, the Frank Capp Juggernaut Orchestra.
I've worked with Frank quite a bit.
And of course, you know what? There are a lot of great college ensembles around.
Okay.
There are some wonderful large ensembles. Mount Sac has a great one. Cal State Long Beach has a wonderful.
Yeah, John Prince has done a great job over there.
Program, absolutely.
And John Henderson, he has a big band playing in Long Beach regularly.
Yes.
There's a lot of good ones.
Jazz is still very healthy. You know, people. There's a lot of talk about trying to keep jazz alive, you know, and that kind of thing.
That bothers me.
Me too.
When somebody talks about resurrecting or bringing back, or what's the word, keeping it alive,
it's
already there.
It's already there.
Yeah.
Right. I liken it to what's happened in Southern California, in Orange County, say. It isn't that people don't still like oranges. They do. You know, Orange County at one time was nothing but oranges. Now it's hard to find an orange in Orange County. People still eat oranges. It's just that the land is more valuable as for something else, and that's what's happened with jazz on the radio. It's become scarce because you can make more money playing some form of rock and roll music. Doesn't mean there isn't an audience for jazz. There is. It's a large audience for jazz, and KLON continues to prove that.
Now, KLON started off then, you're back at the early stage. You made a decision even before the first day you went on the air at the university. Is that correct?
Right. The decision was made to become a full-time jazz station, and we made the transition actually September 1st of 1981.
Now, this was 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, jazz.
Yes, with only a couple of exceptions. We do a lot of news. We have,
okay, yes.
That is it's kind of a dual mission with us. And we have a fine local news staff headed up by Nick Roman that goes out and gets stories. We don't try to compete with
the
CNN.
National News Service.
Yeah.
Okay.
We provide a Southern California-based perspective on the news. And we use AP, Associated Press, for national stories. Mm-hmm. And then our local focus is on Southern California.
Now, you do a lot of, well, there's another voice, a couple of others, 3 or 4 others that I'd like you to mention. One of them is named Helen.
Right. In fact, my claim to fame is that I'm Helen's brother.
Yes, I know.
Helen is, outside of the greatest jazz disc jockey in the world, Chuck Niles, Helen is the most popular personality at KLON. Helen is the midday host. I'm on from 6 to 10 a.m. Helen follows me from 10 to 3. And Helen's laugh is...
It's contagious.
Contagious.
It is.
Yes. Wherever I go, people say to me, you're
Helen's brother.
Aren't
Yeah.
you? Yeah. Is Helen here?
Yeah.
Hey, tell Helen, man, I just love her laugh. You know,
Yeah.
she's great, and you know, stuff she plays is just, you know, I get that all the time.
Well, she has a lot of charm, and she does a lot of interviews, as you do too. And now you have some special things where you're interviewing people, bringing them into the studio.
Yes.
I like that. One of the things that I was agitating, and you and I were working on this for a couple of decades, is that I did some jazz shows for you and also for KSBR at Saddleback College. And one of the first shows I did down there dealt with Stan Kenton, and he had passed away, and all of his memorabilia had gone to North Texas. And I said, here he is right here in Newport Beach. Why did everything go to Texas? And so tell us a little bit about the Jazz Institute that finally has come into being.
We talked about it for a long time and tried to get, it going. Assemblyman Willard Murray has been the driving force behind establishing a West Coast Jazz Institute. And after 3 tries, he finally got it through state government. And it is headquartered now at Cal State Long Beach. It is going to do a number of things. Its focus is going to be on education and on archive and on performance. It is now established, the repository, the archive part of it. They've got their first few major donations, and it is, as I say, based at Cal State Long Beach in a wing of the library there.
What's being donated?
Records, record collections, and collections of photographs, memorabilia of various kinds, books.
Interviews?
Probably they will begin to get interviews.
We should do that, I think.
Yes, they should. Well, starting with KLON's collection.
Right.
We have an archive of our own that's in terrible shape. No one's kept it up, but we have recordings that need to be cataloged. You know, really, this is an archivist's
absolutely.
job. And we have recordings from the very first days as a jazz station, you know, and some of the greatest, all the greatest figures in jazz at the time have been through the station or on the air, at least by phone. People like Count Basie and Milt Jackson and Ray Brown and, you know, you name it, and they've been on KLON.
Yes, and also arrangements so that the students can study it.
Absolutely, charts should definitely be in repository there at the Institute. So we're real excited about that, and excited to have it next door to KLON.
Well, one of the things that really pleased me, Ken, was when we had a meeting and they decided they were going to create a master's degree in jazz in the music department.
Yes.
I feel that was major thing, so that young people who are out there who want to get into the field of music and into jazz in particular, there is an educational degree. There are courses designed to help them.
Yes, Don Para, the dean of the School of Music, and the head of the commercial music program, John Prince, have really got a great program at Cal State Long Beach.
Okay, now, who are some of the people, you were mentioning before the cameras turned on, who are some of the good people who have been working with the Institute, who have been making donations of records and so forth?
Well, let's first start by mentioning the executive director of the Institute, which Cal State Long Beach now has brought in to kind of run the place, a world-renowned jazz man, a fellow named Buddy Collette.
Yes, that's a familiar name.
Not only renowned as a performer, but renowned as a jazz educator. Buddy has worked for 40 years, tirelessly bringing the music into the schools and spending hours in private one-on-one instruction with students. He's a master reed player, plays all the reeds. And so he's the perfect person to head the Institute.
Now that's exciting.
Yes. Then another name we should mention is Ray Avery, because Ray gave the Institute its first donation. A significant number of photographs and memorabilia from his archive.
You mentioned that Ray works with a group of photographers?
Right. I think he is still president of the Jazz Photographers Association. If he isn't, he's a major force in this organization of jazz photographers around Southern California.
I've known Ray for years, but I didn't know that. I knew that he owned Rare Records.
Ray Avery's
store.
Rare Records was a major source for rare recordings in this town for years and years.
Yes.
He has, although he's closed the doors for the commercial side, he still maintains the Ray Avery Jazz Archives of his own, and he has a huge collection of photographs. He's a great resource.
Now, one of the reasons why KLON is called America's Jazz Station instead of Cal
Southern
State Long
California,
Beach or
right.
Southern California is why? What triggered that?
Well, that happened in the mid-'80s. KLON had its signal sent around the country, around the Western Hemisphere, by satellite. We made an arrangement. Now we're carried, originally it was another organization, but we're carried now by the Playboy pay television network. And they use a side channel of their broadcast service for audio. And so you can pick up KLON if you have a direct satellite dish anywhere. We had a listener in Venezuela call us a few days ago. We have a lot of listeners in Yellowknife, Canada, which is up inside the Arctic Circle. It's the capital of the Northern Territories.
Oh, okay.
We have 40 people who are subscribers to KLON from Yellowknife.
Avid fans.
Avid fans.
This
Well,
is great.
there's not that much happening in Yellowknife, I'm sure. And
Okay.
KLON is a major source of musical culture for them.
Yes.
We have listeners in Fort Smith, Arkansas, listeners in Snowmass Village, Colorado, listeners in the Virgin Islands. So we really do reach out by satellite. Then we have a number of cable companies around the country that pick us up and offer the signal to their subscribers.
Now, there was a change in another station that triggered that, and I want to stop on that point for another public service announcement. Then we'll get into what this other station did that brought it about. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Our guest is Ken Borgers. Ken, we were talking about another station that triggered KLON's rise to fame, shall we say.
KKGO.
KKGO.
KKGO was the jazz station in Southern California for 25 or 30 years.
It was known as KBCA, though, wasn't it?
It was, and it was a fine jazz service. I'd grown up, and everybody around here who listened to jazz had grown up listening to first KBCA. They changed their call letters to KKGO. And then a lot of things happened in the market in the mid-'80s. The station that had played classical music here for 40 years.
Oh, KFAC.
KFAC.
I knew Carl Princey. That was a wonderful station.
Oh, it was. And Fred Crane and Thomas Cassidy and
Yes.
Tom Dixon and
Yes.
all those people
Yes.
suddenly were gone, and they changed format, became a rock and roll station. The station was sold. All
They
those
changed the
people were
call
gone.
letters and everything.
Changed call letters, and it's a fine rock and roll service now, but the classical service was gone. The owner of KKGO, Saul Levine, had always wanted to have a classical station. In fact, KKGO started this classical station. It was a classical station for the first year and a half of its life.
When it was KBCA?
Long
Way
ago.
back. Okay.
And then became a jazz station. Well, when KFAC changed format, KGO became a classical service. And its two best-known announcers, Sam Fields and Chuck Niles, joined the staff of KLON. And that was in the mid-'80s.
You mean Chuck Niles didn't want to sit there and play symphonies?
Chuck and Beethoven somehow didn't go together.
Oh, I see.
Chuck Niles has played jazz on the radio for close to half a century.
Yes, okay.
And that wherever jazz goes, there you'll find Chuck Niles. And so Chuck and Sam joined us, and that really was the making of the place.
Well, you said that Chuck even helped you before he joined the staff. He gave you some guidance and some tips.
When we were a struggling little college station trying to play jazz, this receptionist came running in one day and said, "Chuck Niles is on the phone." I thought, yeah, sure, you know. And but I picked up the phone, and you could tell right away that unmistakable voice, you know.
Yes.
"This is Chuck Niles," and he said, "You know, I've got this little shack up here in Pacific Palisades, and you're coming in great." He said, "You know, I just wanted to tell you, love what you're doing," you know. And everything got easier after that.
Yes.
He started putting the word out that KLON was okay, and musicians began calling us and saying, "Well, I never heard of you, but Chuck Niles told me to call, so you've got to be all right." And you know, Chuck was a great champion of ours, even when he was working for another station.
Well, Saul Levine also gave you.
Yes, not only did he give us Sam Fields and Chuck Niles, but he also donated the KKGO Jazz Library when KGO became a classical service.
Oh, that was a major breakthrough right there.
That was also the making of the place musically, because now we have, I think, for sure, the largest jazz library in America.
Ken, I'm going to ask you if you'll remain and do a second show, because they tell me the time is up on this one. So thank you for sharing this with us, and we will do a second show. Thank you for joining us for Adventures in Life, and please join us soon again.